Humble beginnings, the restlessness of Ezekiel Caldwell. Born in 1798 on a patch of rural farmland outside Millbrook, Pennsylvania, Ezekiel Caldwell was the kind of child who looked at a plow not as a tool, but as a chain. He was the eldest son in a modest family that had tilled the same land for 3 generations honest folk who valued simplicity, soil, and Sunday sermons. But Ezekiel was different. While other boys ran barefoot through the cornfields or competed in harvest fairs, Ezekiel was in the woods alone, carving strange symbols into trees and mumbling about destiny. He read whatever he could get his hands on: Bibles, ledgers, almanacs, and later darker volumes borrowed from a traveling bookseller who never returned. What set him apart was not just ambition, but rage. Rage at the smallness of his life, the insignificance of his family, and the endless repetition of poverty that defined his bloodline. He dreamed of wealth not as a goal, but as a rebuke to those who had dismissed his family. The fire that burned in him was not simply ambition, it was defiance, and it smoldered deeper than anyone around him realized. At just 16, Ezekiel left home, traveling to Pittsburgh, where he worked odd jobs and studied under a land surveyor with murky political ties. By 20, he had begun acquiring knowledge of banking property rights and, perhaps more importantly, how to exploit systems built by men who thought themselves untouchable. When he returned to Millbrook in 1825, Ezekiel was no longer the boy from the backwoods. He was a man with gold in his pocket, fire in his eyes, and plans that stretched far beyond the imagination of his neighbors. He hadn't just returned home, he had come to claim it. Acquiring Whispering Ridge, a transaction written in silence. The land Ezekiel purchased on the outskirts of Millbrook was considered by most to be unlucky. Locals called it Whispering Ridge, a densely wooded expanse where the wind always seemed to speak through the trees in tones too mournful to be natural. For generations, people avoided it. Hunters would return pale and shaken, claiming to see figures moving in the morning mist, and animals often refused to enter its inner groves. But for Ezekiel, that unease was a bonus. The land's reputation meant it was undervalued, and its location just outside town, but atop a panoramic hill, was ideal for what he envisioned: a grand estate that would cement the Caldwell name in the stone and soil of Pennsylvania forever. No one knew exactly how Ezekiel had earned enough to purchase 70 acres of prime ridge property, but whispers followed him like shadows. Some said he had made deals with unscrupulous bankers. Others believed he'd blackmailed a dying industrialist. Whatever the truth, the deed was signed without fanfare. There were no negotiations, no town meetings, no consecration of land. Just a quiet transaction processed by a clerk, who would later forget ever filing the paperwork. That clerk's wife would die unexpectedly a week later. His daughter would speak of dreams filled with smoke and bone-colored trees. And yet the real story behind the land was one Ezekiel chose to ignore. It was sacred. Long before settlers came, the Lapi people held the ridge as hallowed ground. Burials weren't just interments, they were rituals of passage, a crossing of thresholds watched over by ancestors and spirits. The ridge was believed to be a spiritual conduit between worlds. Ezekiel didn't care. To him, the land was valuable precisely because it was feared, and that fear, he thought, could be conquered. Desecration as foundation. Building on bones construction began in early spring of 1831. Workers, mostly immigrants and desperate laborers, were hired to clear the trees and prepare the foundation for what Ezekiel called Caldwell House, a name that sounded regal and permanent. But almost immediately the digging unearthed objects that gave pause. First it was arrowheads, then fragments of pottery, and finally bones, human bones. At first they were assumed to be isolated, but soon it became clear the ridge had once been a vast burial ground. The bones were not haphazard. They were arranged with care, often accompanied by stone tokens, beads and ceremonial feathers. Some skeletons had red ochre staining their skulls, suggesting they belonged to spiritual leaders. A lesser man would have stopped. A better man would have consulted the Lappi elders, still living on the outskirts of Millbrook. But Ezekiel saw the finds not as a warning, but as an inconvenience. He gave clear orders, continued digging. But quietly. The workers were told to destroy what they found. Grind the bones, scatter the objects, bury anything that looked ceremonial, and worst of all, mix it with the building material. Bones were added to the mortar. Clay from burial mounds was baked into bricks. Sacred soil became sewage foundation. Even the house's stained glass windows were rumored to have been colored with mineral pigments ground from grave artifacts. Some workers quit. Others spoke of nightmares. One man claimed to see children's faces staring up from the soil. Another said he found a skull in his satchel that hadn't been there the day before. All were silenced either by fear or Ezekiel's threats. By late autumn, the bones had stopped surfacing, but not because they were gone. They were now part of the mansion itself, the shifting of the air. A house that didn't want to be built. From the moment the first stones were laid, the ridge resisted. Tools went missing. Horses refused to climb the final slope. Trees that had been felled mysteriously stood again by morning roots exposed, but somehow upright. Laborers began refusing to work alone. One was found gibbering in the woods, clutching a child's jawbone and mumbling prayers in a language no one recognized. Ezekiel's behavior became erratic. He stopped sleeping. He would walk the grounds at night with a lantern, whispering to himself. One foreman reported that Ezekiel had started carving symbols into the basement walls, symbols that matched no known alphabet. He forbade anyone from entering the cellar after sundown. Then there were the sounds. Drums in the distance, chanting with no source, and worse, silence. The kind of silence so heavy it pressed against the chest and dulled the ears. Even the birds stopped singing around the site. What should have been a proud moment of legacy and prestige turned instead into a quietly whispered warning throughout Millbrook. Still the mansion rose, a hulking Gothic silhouette with pointed arches and spired rooftops. Ezekiel insisted on finishing it by winter as if racing some unseen deadline. When it was complete, it stood like a tombstone against the sky, beautiful, yes, but wrong. So wrong that even strangers passing through town crossed themselves as they looked up at Prospect Hill. No one realized it then, but the house had already begun to feed, not on blood, but on memory. On legacy, on bones, a mind unraveling in brick and shadow. By the time Caldwell House was completed in the winter of 1832, it was no longer clear who had built it. Ezekiel or something working through him. The man who had once been articulate, focused, and ruthless in his ambition had become gaunt, erratic, and deeply disturbed. His formerly sharp blue eyes were now ringed with crimson, his gaze unfocused and twitching. His hands, once steady from years of precise writing and accounting, now shook as he reached for things that weren't there. He spoke less in English and more in fragmented sentences that his family didn't recognize. Margaret, his wife, would later write that she awoke one night to find him scribbling circles and jagged lines into a ledger by candlelight, repeating the phrase, "We owe them. We owe them. It was never ours to build." But it was already built. A towering stone mansion with arched windows, ornate carvings of angels and gargoyles, and a front door so heavy it required 3 men to open it. Ezekiel had imported materials from Europe: Italian marble, German glass, but beneath all that grandeur were the crushed bones and sacred relics of the Lapided. The house was beautiful by architectural standards, but repulsive in a way that no one could explain. Visiting merchants left quickly. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid even glancing at it. Margaret tried to celebrate their triumph. She hosted parties, invited the local clergy, even paid for a chamber quartet from Philadelphia. But none of it mattered. Guests complained of nausea, of headaches, of seeing figures standing in the corners of empty rooms. One woman fainted near the staircase and later claimed she felt hands push her. A child went missing during a garden party and was found hours later, locked in the cellar, weeping about the singing bones. Still, Ezekiel smiled. Still, he insisted the house was a monument. "Let them be afraid," he once told Margaret. "They fear power they don't understand." But we've been chosen for what he never said, or maybe he didn't know. The mansion comes alive. Whispers, weeping, and the walls. That watched it began subtly, just enough for Margaret to dismiss at first. A cold breeze in a sealed room, candles that refused to light, the baby monitor, a simple tin funnel crackling with what sounded like whispers in a tongue neither parent understood. But on the night of October 18th, 1832, the house made itself known. Margaret awoke to the sound of a baby crying. She rushed to Thomas's room, but when she arrived, the child was asleep, breathing steadily in his cradle. And yet the crying persisted, growing louder, echoing through the walls, until it became a wail of such heartbreak and fury that Margaret collapsed in terror. She swore it came from the foundation itself. The events escalated quickly. Doors slammed without warning. Windows that had been shut were found wide open. Family heirlooms vanished and reappeared in strange places inside the fireplace, submerged in water basins, buried in garden soil. Thomas, barely a year old, began pointing to corners of the room and laughing as if he saw someone there. When asked, he would say things like "the man in feathers" or "the bone mother." The staff began to quit. First the cook, who claimed to have seen a shadow crawl across the ceiling. Then the groundskeeper, who refused to explain why he left, only muttering, "That house is looking at me." Only one maid remained, a deaf woman named Clara, who could not hear the sounds that tormented the others. Even the architecture shifted. A hallway that once ended at a window now led to a bricked wall. A staircase creaked when no one was on it, the wood groaning like a voice in pain. The stained glass windows, especially the one in the dining room, sometimes glowed red at night, though no light source could be found. And through it all, Ezekiel descended further into madness, spending his nights wandering the house with a lantern and a bundle of dried sage, muttering prayers not from any Bible, but something older. Phantom phenomena escalate. The spirits take form. By the spring of 1833, there was no longer any doubt. The house was not merely haunted, it was possessed. Margaret began to see them clearly. Now figures in traditional native dress faces, painted with black and crimson, standing motionless at the edge of the nursery or by the mirror in the drawing room. They never moved, never spoke. But their silence was worse than any scream. Once, while changing Thomas's clothes, Margaret turned to find an elder spirit standing behind her, his eyes burning with grief. When she blinked, he vanished, but her arms were covered in handprints. No bruises, just an imprint as if the air itself had remembered touch. The household grew colder. Ice formed on the glass panes in midsummer. Flames in the fireplace refused to catch. Food spoiled overnight. Even milk drawn fresh from the cow turned black by morning. The family's dog Rex refused to enter the mansion after dusk. One evening they found him outside the kitchen door, whimpering, his snout coated in ash. Thomas, now 3, spoke fluently to invisible companions. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he screamed. He told to Margaret that the men in the floor don't like Daddy, and once described in frightening detail how bones feel when they're crushed. He said he'd seen it in the walls. Visitors to the house no longer stayed long. A doctor sent to examine Thomas refused to return. He claimed the boy's drawings, charcoal sketches of burial mounds, crying spirits, and men in European clothing, crushing bones, were beyond his experience. This child is either possessed or deeply traumatized, he said. Either way, he must be removed from that place. But Ezekiel refused. He now believed the spirits were not tormentors, but messengers. "They're guiding me," he told Margaret. "They see what others cannot. I'm not cursed, I'm being initiated." Margaret no longer recognized her husband, and she began to fear it was already too late to save her son. Children targeted, inheriting the sins of the father. The house didn't just torment Ezekiel and Margaret, it hunted their children. And whatever intelligence animated the curse, it seemed to delight in twisting innocence into vessels of grief. Thomas, once a cheerful and curious toddler, became reclusive and pale. He often stood for hours in front of the fireplace, staring into nothing. He would whisper to himself occasionally, speaking in what sounded like Native American dialects, despite never having heard one spoken. He referred to the ones in the dark and once asked, "Margaret, when do I have to go under the dirt like they did?" Margaret wept when he said that. But worse still was Sarah. Born in 1835 during a time of heightened paranormal activity, Sarah entered the world with twisted limbs and cataracted eyes. The midwife, a local woman with experience in difficult births, called it a cursed child. Her voice trembled as she swaddled the infant and handed her to Margaret, whispering, "You must leave this place. She's not meant to be raised here." Sarah was quiet. Too quiet. She didn't cry unless brought into the nursery, but if taken near the basement door, she would scream until her voice broke. At night, Margaret sometimes found her crawling toward the base of the stairs, reaching out toward the stones, cooing as if hearing a lullaby from below. Ezekiel refused to acknowledge the child's condition. He said she was blessed, touched by the spirits in ways others couldn't understand. He began holding her during his midnight walks around the house. Margaret feared he was offering her to whatever entity lurked in the shadows. Then one day Thomas was found in the garden digging a hole with his bare hands. "For Sarah," he said. "She'll need a place soon." It was then Margaret knew. The spirits were not content to punish Ezekiel alone. They wanted the next generation, winter of madness. The house seals its fate. The winter of 1836 descended on Millbrook like a final breath, cold and suffocating. Snow fell early and refused to leave. Roads were buried, trees cracked under the weight of ice, and inside Caldwell House the curse reached its crescendo. The mansion, long plagued by whispered voices and shadowy figures, now pulsed with supernatural violence. It began with a blizzard that cut off the house from the outside world for nearly 2 weeks. No supplies, no visitors, just the family trapped inside a structure that had long since stopped being a home. Doors slammed shut and wouldn't open again. Windows iced over from the inside, and the fireplace, once their only source of warmth, sputtered with flames that hissed as though resisting the very air. Margaret kept her children close, moving them from room to room, trying to outrun the cold. But the temperature wasn't natural. Even when bundled beneath blankets, their breath fogged the air. Ice formed along the hallway walls. Water left in basins froze solid, and mirrors clouded with frost, even when touched by firelight. But worst of all was the sound. It never stopped. From the floorboards and the basement, the relentless drumming continued, slow, rhythmic, and ancient, accompanied by low chanting that echoed through the halls like wind through a hollow chest. It grew louder at night, vibrating through their bones. At first, Margaret thought it might drive her mad, but when it stopped for a single hour on the 3rd night, the silence was worse. It was as if the house was listening. Ezekiel was no longer Ezekiel. He had become something else, his hair bone-white, his skin papery and dry. He rarely blinked. On the 7th night, Margaret woke to find him standing at the foot of their bed, eyes rolled back, mouth moving silently as his hands made ritualistic gestures she didn't recognize. When she called out, he turned to her with a look so filled with rage and hatred that she screamed and fled with the children, locking them in the nursery. That night, Thomas drew figures in the frost on the window, figures of people being buried alive. Sarah rocked silently, eyes wide, whispering, "They're underneath us." The house was no longer haunted. It had become an altar. Margaret's discovery. The hidden chamber of bone and sin. In the hours before dawn, while the house briefly fell silent, Margaret knew what she had to do. She had lived in fear too long, watching her children unravel, her husband vanish into madness, her own sanity hang by a thread. She crept into the basement alone, guided only by a single candle, and the memory of where Ezekiel always disappeared during his midnight wanderings. What she found behind a false wall in the cellar was not a storage room or a wine rack. It was a shrine. There, stacked and arranged with disturbing precision, were the remains of the desecrated Lapi-dead, skulls adorned with fading ochre, ceremonial blades rusted with time, beads, feathers, and shrouds all mixed with fragments of mortar from the mansion itself. The bones had not just been hidden, they had been curated. In the center of the space sat a thick, leather-bound journal. Ezekiel's handwriting filled its pages, his slanted, obsessive script detailing every moment of the desecration. He had known what the land was. He had chosen it because of its power. He documented the dreams, the whispers, the visions, the warnings, and then, disturbingly, the instructions. Some passages read like madness. The blood must be folded into stone. Others were even more disturbing in their clarity. Every skull is a key. Every drumbeat opens a door. But one passage, written just days prior, chilled Margaret to her core. They spoke to me. They said the debt is ours. The payment will be through the children. The curse will not stop. It must run until the line is ended. Margaret's hands trembled as she closed the journal. She knew what had to be done. She had to get the children out. Now. Flight into night. The last hope for the innocent. Margaret didn't wait until morning. Clutching the journal and the children, she packed only the essentials: blankets, food, a cross, and a single lantern. The snow was still heavy, but something in her bones told her that if she stayed even one more night, none of them would leave alive. Thomas asked where they were going. Sarah didn't speak, only stared ahead with clouded eyes. As Margaret crept down the hall with her children bundled against her sides, she passed by the parlor and saw Ezekiel standing alone, muttering to the fireplace. The flames had turned blue. She left a letter for him, one final plea for him to come to his senses, to abandon the house, to reclaim his soul. But deep down, she knew he was already gone. They slipped out through the servants' entrance just before dawn, wading through waist-deep snow. The wind howled around them, but the silence behind them was worse. No one pursued, no one stopped them. The house for the first time was quiet. They reached the edge of town by nightfall, finding shelter at the home of Margaret's cousin, who lived just outside Millbrook. Margaret refused to explain what had happened. She only said, "We left everything behind. We must never go back." The children were exhausted, but safe. For now. Ezekiel's end, madness sealed in stone. The mansion swallowed him. After Margaret's departure, Ezekiel remained inside Caldwell House for 3 weeks, alone. Neighbors reported seeing candlelight in the upper windows. Others heard the drums, but no one approached. A sense of dread surrounded the property like a fog, and even the bravest townsfolk refused to climb Prospect Hill. On the morning of February 3rd, 1837, Sheriff William Barnes gathered a small group and forced their way into the mansion. What they found inside would haunt them forever. Ezekiel was in the main hall, seated in a high-backed chair beneath the stained glass. His eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, his mouth agape as though screaming in his final moment. Around him, hundreds of candles burned low. The walls were carved with symbols, some matching Lapi sacred markings, others completely unknown. But it was the floor that horrified them. In the center of the room, a large circle had been drawn using a mixture of ash and ground bone. And within the circle, the remnants of ceremonial objects burned, feathers, shattered pottery, and tiny bones, clearly from children. Whether he had summoned something, or had been claimed by it, no one could say. The coroner listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest due to extreme emotional trauma. But the sheriff had another theory. Ezekiel Caldwell had been scared to death by the dead themselves. The curse continues. Children of silence and shadows. After Ezekiel's death, Millbrook breathed a sigh of relief. The townspeople hoped that the nightmare had ended with him. The mansion was sealed. The Caldwell name faded from polite conversation, but the curse had not died. It had only begun to move. Margaret had taken Thomas and Sarah to Philadelphia into the care of her sister's family. For the first few months, life seemed normal. Sarah's health improved marginally. Her bones still twisted, her sight still cloudy, but her fits ceased. Thomas began to laugh again. Margaret thought for a moment that perhaps the curse had been tied to the land, the house, to Ezekiel's madness. Then came Thomas's 8th birthday. That night he awoke screaming, his voice raw, his body thrashing. He said they were back. The sad men had found him. Margaret tried to soothe him, but he clung to her and whispered things no child should know. descriptions of burial grounds, chants in a language no one had taught him, and names of tribal elders that had not been spoken aloud for generations. The drawings returned. Just like before, Thomas sketched figures rising from the earth, warriors, mourners, mothers with shattered eyes, always emerging from the soil, always angry. Then the scratches began. Red, thin, angry marks appeared on his legs and arms overnight. No animal had touched him. No object in the room could have made them. Margaret moved his bed, nailed shut the windows, installed locks on the doors. Nothing helped. The markings returned, sometimes fresh with blood as if carved by invisible hands. Sarah, now 7, grew eerily silent. She watched her brother with strange calm, as though she understood what was happening but refused to speak of it. Then, one morning, she began muttering in soft syllables while staring at the family fireplace. The housemaid swore she heard her say, "The debt remains unpaid." Margaret realized the curse was not bound by walls or distance. It had followed them, the mark of blood, the family's inescapable legacy. Margaret's attempts to explain away the events as childhood trauma were increasingly futile. Her children knew things no one had told them, ceremonial rites, ancient symbols, and sacred customs of a people long erased from the local records. She reached out to scholars, doctors, priests. None could help. The family became isolated once again, this time in the heart of the city. One priest, Father Delaney, agreed to conduct a blessing, but the moment he entered the home, he turned pale and demanded to know what lay buried beneath the floorboards. When Margaret told him they had fled from a cursed estate, he refused to proceed, whispering, "Only, it's not the house. It's the blood." Thomas began sleepwalking. He would rise at midnight and trace circles on the floor in chalk. Sometimes they matched symbols from Ezekiel's journal. Sometimes they were new. Sarah, meanwhile, would wake screaming about the watchers at the door. She once pointed to an empty corner and said, "They're waiting to take us back." Margaret sought help from a local historian who specialized in Native American folklore. The woman took one look at Thomas's drawings and whispered the name of an old Lapi war chief, a figure long associated with retribution and spiritual justice. She urged Margaret to leave the city, to disappear, to change her name. But Margaret had reached a breaking point. She believed she had to return to where it all began, to confront the spirits, to beg for forgiveness on behalf of a family that had desecrated the sacred and built their pride on the bones of the dead. In the summer of 1842, Margaret packed what little they owned and returned to Millbrook, returned to Prospect Hill, a home swallowed by time. The mansion was not as they remembered it. Prospect Hill had become overgrown, vines wrapped around the stone walls like veins of the earth reclaiming its own. The windows, once stained with imported glass, were shattered. The front door was caved in. Trees once cleared by Ezekiel's ambition had crept back and stood like sentinels in judgment. But the worst part was the feeling. As Margaret and her children approached the house, the air grew thick, heavy. Breathing became laborious. Even the animals fell silent. Sarah gripped her mother's hand and whispered. They never left. Inside, the house had decayed. Mold crept up the walls. The air was cold despite the summer sun. Dust lay thick, yet no insect stirred. It felt preserved not by time, but by something older, something sacred. Margaret lit candles and unpacked a worn satchel containing the only hope. She had pages of Ezekiel's journal, a bundle of sage ceremonial items she had acquired from Lappi elders in Philadelphia, and a crude map of the mansion's spiritual hotspots. She believed a ritual could be performed to make amends, a symbolic burial, a cleansing of space and soul. She never had the chance. The moment the door closed behind them, the house came alive. The house awakens, vengeance unleashed. It began with a sound so low it vibrated the spine, the drumming. It rose from the foundation, steady, ancient, relentless. Then came the chanting layered voices in impossible harmony, overlapping like wind over bones. The doors slammed shut, windows sealed. The house, silent for 5 years, roared with fury. Ice formed on the interior walls. Flames snuffed themselves out. The temperature dropped so drastically that Thomas's breath fogged despite standing beside a lit lantern. Sarah began to weep without sound. Then they appeared, not as shadows, but as solid, unmistakable forms. Spirits of the desecrated dead emerged, warriors with war paint and headdresses, mothers carrying infants, children with hollow eyes. The air grew so heavy that Margaret collapsed to her knees. Her eyes met those of a figure who stepped forward, him, the same war chief from the dreams, the same face from Thomas's drawings and Margaret's nightmares. He spoke. "You have returned to the place of your shame." Margaret tried to speak, to offer the ritual, to plead for forgiveness, but the chief shook his head. "The time for amends has passed," he said. "The debt must be paid, and it will be paid in blood." The room filled with a wailing so powerful that the candle flame spiraled upward before extinguishing completely. The curse had waited. Now it had come to collect. The night of reckoning. One family, final stand. What happened that night inside the Caldwell mansion has never been fully pieced together. There were no witnesses, no rescue, only fragments, a torn journal, scorched floorboards, bloodless bones, and a silence so thick it seemed to hum. But Margaret, in her final moments of lucidity, wrote down enough for historians and ghost hunters to guess the horrors they endured. It began with Thomas. The boy had always been sensitive, always open to the spirit's whispers. But that night, something overtook him entirely. Margaret watched in terror as her son fell into a seizure. His body writhed on the parlor floor, his hands clawing the air, his voice shrieking in a language neither English nor fully Lappi, yet somehow both. His skin turned gray, his eyes glazed white. "They're under me," he screamed. "They're pulling me through the roots." Margaret tried to hold him down, but the moment her hand touched his, her mind was filled with visions, not dreams, but memories. Someone else's memories. She saw ancient funeral rites, sacred dances, warriors anointed with ochre. Then she saw fire, colonists with shovels, destruction. And finally Ezekiel, her husband, laughing while bone was crushed beneath boot. When she came to Thomas, was dead, his body frozen in a seated position, eyes open wide, mouth gaping, just like his father. But the house wasn't finished. Sarah's suffering. The voice of the buried dead. Sarah, always the quiet one, had begun to speak, but it wasn't her voice. For hours, she sat near the sealed basement door, rocking in place and chanting in a dozen voices, male, female, old, young, all speaking in rhythms too ancient for human memory. Margaret tried to reach her, to pull her from the trance, but Sarah looked at her with clouded eyes and whispered, "You're too late, Mama. They're already inside." Her body convulsed. The twisted limbs she was born with seemed to writhe on their own, cracking as if reshaping themselves. Margaret watched in horror as her daughter screamed not in pain but in collective agony. She described burial rites in vivid detail, how the bodies were laid with tobacco and feathers, how songs were sung until the sun set. She spoke of names of sacred hills, of treaties broken and bones scattered. And then she began to choke, not on food, but on silence. Her final words were barely audible. They never forgot. They never forgive. Margaret found her the next morning curled in the cellar, resting against a stack of skulls Ezekiel had hidden years before. She was still peaceful, but cold. Her body had aged. Though only 8, she looked 20, perhaps older, perhaps ancient. Margaret's final hour. Memory as punishment. Margaret Caldwell had lost everything: her home, her husband, her children, and now her reason. But she did not flee. She could not. The mansion had become a prison, a tomb with open doors that led nowhere. Every time she tried to leave, the house would shift, doors would vanish, stairs would fold into themselves, windows would open into walls of brick. But something worse awaited her than death. Memory. Each time she closed her eyes, she was drawn into a vision, not a dream, but an ancestral replay. She saw the land before colonists, the Lapi children dancing in the meadows, elders performing rites at sunset, bones buried with reverence, not secrecy. She saw the harmony that once existed, and then she saw it destroyed. Over and over she witnessed Ezekiel's men dig into sacred soil. She watched bones thrown into carts like refuse. She saw ceremonial masks split apart and used as kindling. And always, always, the drums, not as music, but as mourning. She awoke one morning in the same chair where her husband had died, surrounded by the same candle stubs, the same symbols etched in blood. But something was wrong. Her body was decayed. Though she had only been alone for days, her flesh had begun to rot. Her hair thinned, her skin yellowed with the hue of long burial. A neighbor who peeked in through a window days later claimed she looked weeks dead, yet still sat upright, her eyes wide open. When the sheriff finally broke in, they found her like that, frozen in remembrance, a bloodline broken, but not buried with Margaret's death in early 1837. Many in Millbrook hoped the horror had ended. Ezekiel's mansion was sealed with iron chains. The land was fenced. The town council issued a decree forbidding future development on Prospect Hill. And for several years the area fell silent. But the dead remember, and so does the blood. Unbeknownst to the town, the Caldwell line had not ended. While Ezekiel's immediate family was gone, his younger brother, Samuel Caldwell, still lived. A merchant in Boston, Samuel had remained estranged from his brother, dismissing his tales of grandeur and growing madness. He had never visited the mansion, never seen the land, never believed in curses. In 1843, Samuel received word of the deaths. The property had passed to him by default. To him, it was just an asset prime land in a growing township. He packed his belongings, moved his wife and 3 children to Millbrook, and prepared to take what he believed was owed to his branch of the family. The townspeople didn't stop him. They wanted it forgotten. But the curse hadn't forgotten them, and it certainly hadn't forgotten Samuel. Samuel Caldwell, a man of logic, meets a house of ghosts. Samuel Caldwell was everything his brother Ezekiel once pretended to be, composed, educated, a believer in order and industry. A successful merchant in Boston, he had built a reputation on fair dealings and civic charity. So when the deed to a Pennsylvania estate came into his possession, he saw opportunity, not danger. He ignored the letters from Millbrook, the ones that warned of strange happenings, and begged him to sell the land site unseen. He disregarded the rumors of haunted halls and ancestral curses as the ravings of backwoods provincials, and he certainly didn't believe the strange letter found among Margaret's belongings, which simply read, "If you bear the Caldwell name, don't open the door." In the summer of 1843, Samuel, his wife Rebecca, and their 3 children, James 15, Mary, 12, and little Elizabeth 8, arrived at the gates of Caldwell House. The vines had been cut back. The structure, though battered by time and neglect, still stood tall atop Prospect Hill. To Samuel, it was a monument to reclamation. To his wife, it was unsettling. To the children, it was a trap. From the moment they entered the house, recognized them, and it remembered. That first night, the fireplace refused to light. Rebecca heard whispering from behind the nursery door, and James, bold and rational like his father, swore he heard digging beneath the floorboards. By week's end, the drumming had returned. Spirits reawakened. The pattern begins again. The manifestations didn't come all at once. They returned with purpose, like rehearsed players in a ritual drama. First, the shadows. They lingered in corners, behind staircases, or just beyond candlelight. They never moved while watched, but always shifted when eyes turned away. Then came the whispers, soft chants in languages no one in the family understood, rising from the basement at night. James began disappearing for hours. They would find him in the cellar, his hands caked with dirt, clawing at the earth with bloody fingers. When asked what he was doing, he simply said, "Helping them go home." He remembered none of it afterward. Mary, meanwhile, grew obsessed with flame. She stared at candles until her eyes watered, claiming she could see faces flickering in the wax. "They burned, too," she whispered once, holding her hand dangerously close to the flame. She began to set small fires, first in the fireplace, then in the corners of rooms. One morning, Rebecca found a ring of burnt dolls on Mary's bedroom floor, arranged like mourners. Elizabeth aged unnaturally fast. The vibrant 8-year-old girl began to wrinkle. Her hair grayed, her voice deepened. But worse than the physical change was her speech. She began speaking in the voice of an old woman, sometimes reverent, sometimes furious, telling stories of sacred dances, burial rites, and foreign men who scattered our bones for bricks. No one had taught her those stories. Rebecca, increasingly disturbed, begged Samuel to leave. But Caldwell pride had rooted him, and the house was feeding again. Madame Zelda, the spiritualist's terrible revelation, desperate. Rebecca turned to someone the townspeople called only Madame Zelda, a traveling spiritualist known for unorthodox methods and occasional success in dealing with restless spirits. She arrived at Caldwell House wearing violet veils, silver rings, and a gaze far too old for her smooth skin. Zelda claimed she could feel the house's heartbeat before stepping inside. "You've built on what was never yours," she muttered, running her hand across the threshold. She stayed 3 nights performing seances, rituals, and trances meant to connect with the spirits. Her findings were documented in letters she wrote to her sister, found decades later in an antique shop in Salem. According to those accounts, Caldwell House was unlike anything she had encountered. It was not haunted by one spirit, or even many. It was infested a hive of unrest, a prison for souls denied passage. Zelda described seeing a swirling mass of ghostly figures in the attic, all clothed in the regalia of the Lapi people. They did not speak to her. They stared, judged. She claimed to have heard the mother of all mourners sobbing in the parlor. She saw Margaret's spirit in the upstairs hallway holding the hand of a deformed child. Most chillingly, she reported encountering Ezekiel himself, not as a malevolent spirit, but as a broken one trapped, punished, used by the very souls he had desecrated. He begged her to leave. He begged her to burn the house down. But when she asked him how his mouth disappeared, on the third night she was found unconscious at the base of the basement stairs. Her hair turned white, her eyes wide with terror. She never spoke of what she saw again. Her only words before leaving were, "It's not just them anymore. They're gathering, fighting the unseen." Samuel's final defiance. Samuel, faced with his family's crumbling sanity, responded not with flight, but with war. He believed that whatever haunted them could be exorcised, purged with fire and faith. He ordered local clergy to perform blessings. He bought salt crucifixes and even hired a bricklayer to seal off the basement. None of it worked. Each night, the activity intensified. Walls bled, the house groaned, objects flew through rooms unprovoked. A chandelier dropped inches from Samuel's head during dinner. The spirits weren't just angry, they were organized. So Samuel went further. He began burning parts of the mansion he believed were infected. The library, the attic, the garden shed where Thomas once buried bones. But the fire wouldn't take. It would sputter reverse direction or vanish altogether. One night, he threw a lantern into the nursery. It exploded, and yet the curtains remained unburned. He screamed into the cellar, "Come for me, not my family." And something did. That night, Rebecca awoke to find Samuel gone. His journal was open on the dining room table, covered in his blood. The final page repeated a single phrase over and over: "They will never let us go." When they found his body in the basement the next morning, it was twisted in ways no human could manage. The walls were covered in handprints, too many hands, and all of them pointed to the floor, to where the bones were waiting. The final toll. The deaths of the Caldwell children. The deaths of Samuel's children were not swift nor merciful. Each one seemed orchestrated not by fate, but by the spirits themselves, as if each moment had been rehearsed over decades. Vengeance, after all, is patient. James was the first. He vanished during a thunderstorm in early April 1844. The family assumed he had escaped into the woods in another of his fugue states. A search party was formed, torches lit, hounds loosed, but nothing was found for 6 days. On the 7th, his body was discovered in a shallow grave behind the house. His hands were raw, bloodied, the nails torn from his fingers. The coroner, horrified, determined he had buried himself alive. The grave bore ceremonial stones around the perimeter. Lapi symbols had been carved into the bark of nearby trees, symbols no one alive should have known. Mary's death followed just weeks later. Rebecca found her daughter lying peacefully in her room, surrounded by dozens of candle stubs arranged in a circle. The girl's body was untouched by flame, but her skin was burned as though she had been slowly roasted from within. There were no signs of smoke, no scorched floorboards, no evidence of combustion, yet her eyes were melted shut. Her lips fused, the most chilling detail. Every candle had burned down at precisely the same time. an impossible synchronicity, as if something had planned it. Little Elizabeth, whose hair had turned entirely white by then, lived the longest but suffered the most. By the time of her death, she no longer resembled a child. Her face was lined with age, her bones brittle and hunched. She would sit for hours in the parlor, humming loppy funeral songs. Her drawings, once crude, had become detailed renderings of sacred rites, burial scaffolds, and ceremonial dances. She died in her sleep, her final words whispered to no one. "They're almost done. Rebecca Caldwell." A mother's despair. A house that wouldn't burn. Rebecca Caldwell was a shell of a woman by the time her last child was buried. She no longer cried. She no longer spoke. She wandered the mansion in silence, brushing her hands along the walls like she was touching the inside of a tomb. She stopped eating. The only sound she ever made was the lighting of matches and the weeping when they refused to burn. She tried again and again to burn the house down. She soaked curtains in lamp oil. She built tinder piles in the attic. She poured kerosene through the halls. But the flames never caught. The fire would sputter, die, reverse. Once the flames consumed her dress, yet left the wood beneath her untouched. One night, she sat in the main hall, the same chair where both Margaret and Ezekiel had died. She held her children's drawings in her lap, soaked in tears and blood. Then she lit one final match. Witnesses later swore they saw the mansion glow blue from within just for a moment. When the townsfolk broke in days later, they found her still in the chair, her body intact. No burns, no wounds. But her face was contorted in horror, her mouth wide, her hands grasping at the air as if trying to stop something from dragging her under. She had died begging for a fire that never came. The Shadow Army. A curse. No longer bound. Samuel Caldwell was the last of his line to die, and his death was the most violent of all. His body was found in the basement where Ezekiel once performed his rituals. Unlike his predecessors, Samuel had been torn apart. His limbs were broken at unnatural angles. His skin was etched with hundreds of overlapping symbols, many of which had never been recorded in any known language. The walls were dripping with blood, not painted, not written, weeping. His final journal entry, scrawled in jagged bleeding script, repeated the same line over and over. "They will never let us go. They will never let us go. They will never let us go." It became clear to the town of Millbrook that the mansion on Prospect Hill was more than haunted. It was active. The spirits no longer needed the Caldwell bloodline to manifest. They had organized, militarized. Locals began to report sightings of a shadow army, dozens of figures moving in unison through the trees, marching in absolute silence. Hunters vanished. Children were found sleepwalking toward the hill, eyes glazed. The town council tried to act, but by then it was too late. Sealing the wound. A town abandons itself. The federal government got involved in the spring of 1844. Reports had reached Washington about unexplained deaths, missing persons, and mass hysteria in Millbrook. Officials sent a 4-man investigation team. Only one returned. The others were never found, not even their bones. The survivor, Captain Theodore Harrison, was discovered weeks later, wandering the forest naked and raving. His report, later classified and hidden in the National Archives, described the mansion as a living entity. He claimed the house was a gate, a bleeding wound between the world of the living and the realm of the vengeful dead. He warned that the spirits were recruiting, that they were building something. He called it the Great Gathering. In 1852, the government condemned the mansion and the entire surrounding area. They posted armed guards, planted warning signs, and declared Millbrook a federal disaster zone. One by one, the remaining families fled. Shops closed. Schools emptied. Homes were left to rot. By the winter of that year, Millbrook was a ghost town. But even after the evacuation reports continued, drums in the distance, fires that burned cold, apparitions in abandoned homes, and one recurring vision seen by travelers, a little girl in white hair standing at the edge of the forest, her eyes hollow, her hand outstretched. The mansion still stood, waiting, the final toll. The deaths of the Caldwell children. The deaths of Samuel's children were not swift nor merciful. Each one seemed orchestrated not by fate, but by the spirits themselves, as if each moment had been rehearsed over decades. Vengeance, after all, is patient. James was the first. He vanished during a thunderstorm in early April 1844. The family assumed he had escaped into the woods in another of his fugue states. A search party was formed, torches lit, hounds loosed, but nothing was found for 6 days. On the 7th, his body was discovered in a shallow grave behind the house. His hands were raw, bloody, the nails torn from his fingers. The coroner, horrified, determined he had buried himself alive. The grave bore ceremonial stones around the perimeter. Lapi symbols had been carved into the bark of nearby trees, symbols no one alive should have known. Mary's death followed just weeks later. Rebecca found her daughter lying peacefully in her room surrounded by dozens of candle stubs arranged in a circle. The girl's body was untouched by flame, but her skin was burned as though she had been slowly roasted from within. There were no signs of smoke, no scorched floorboards, no evidence of combustion. Yet her eyes were melted shut, her lips fused. The most chilling detail, every candle had burned down at precisely the same time, an impossible synchronicity, as if something had planned it. Little Elizabeth, whose hair had turned entirely white by then, lived the longest but suffered the most. By the time of her death, she no longer resembled a child. Her face was lined with age, her bones brittle and hunched. She would sit for hours in the parlor humming Lapi funeral songs. Her drawings, once crude, had become detailed renderings of sacred rites, burial scaffolds, and ceremonial dances. She died in her sleep, her final words whispered to no one. "They're almost done. Rebecca Caldwell." A mother's despair. A house that wouldn't burn. Rebecca Caldwell was a shell of a woman by the time her last child was buried. She no longer cried. She no longer spoke. She wandered the mansion in silence, brushing her hands along the walls like she was touching the inside of a tomb. She stopped eating. The only sound she ever made was the lighting of matches and the weeping when they refused to burn. She tried again and again to burn the house down. She soaked curtains in lamp oil. She built tinder piles in the attic. She poured kerosene through the halls, but the flames never caught. The fire would sputter, die, reverse. Once the flames consumed her dress, yet left the wood beneath her untouched. One night she sat in the main hall, the same chair where both Margaret and Ezekiel had died. She held her children's drawings in her lap, soaked in tears and blood. Then she lit one final match. Witnesses later swore they saw the mansion glow blue from within just for a moment. When the townsfolk broke in days later, they found her still in the chair, her body intact. No burns, no wounds, but her face was contorted in horror, her mouth wide, her hands grasping at the air as if trying to stop something from dragging her under. She had died begging for a fire that never came. The Shadow Army. A curse, no longer bound. Samuel Caldwell was the last of his line to die, and his death was the most violent of all. His body was found in the basement where Ezekiel once performed his rituals. Unlike his predecessors, Samuel had been torn apart. His limbs were broken at unnatural angles. His skin was etched with hundreds of overlapping symbols, many of which had never been recorded in any known language. The walls were dripping with blood, not painted, not written, weeping. His final journal entry, scrawled in jagged bleeding script, repeated the same line over and over. They will never let us go. They will never let us go. They will never let us go. It became clear to the town of Millbrook that the mansion on Prospect Hill was more than haunted. It was active. The spirits no longer needed the Caldwell bloodline to manifest. They had organized, militarized. Locals began to report sightings of a shadow army, dozens of figures moving in unison through the trees, marching in absolute silence. Hunters vanished. Children were found sleepwalking toward the hill, eyes glazed. The town council tried to act, but by then it was too late, sealing the wound. A town abandons itself. The federal government got involved in the spring of 1844. Reports had reached Washington about unexplained deaths, missing persons, and mass hysteria in Millbrook. Officials sent a 4-man investigation team. Only one returned. The others were never found, not even their bones. The survivor, Captain Theodore Harrison, was discovered weeks later, wandering the forest naked and raving. His report, later classified and hidden in the National Archives, described the mansion as a living entity. He claimed the house was a gate, a bleeding wound between the world of the living and the realm of the vengeful dead. He warned that the spirits were recruiting, that they were building something. He called it the Great Gathering. In 1852, the government condemned the mansion and the entire surrounding area. They posted armed guards, planted warning signs, and declared Millbrook a federal disaster zone. One by one, the remaining families fled. Shops closed, schools emptied. Homes were left to rot. By the winter of that year, Millbrook was a ghost town, but even after the evacuation, reports continued. Drums in the distance, fires that burned cold, apparitions in abandoned homes, and one recurring vision seen by travelers, a little girl in white hair standing at the edge of the forest, her eyes hollow, her hand outstretched. The mansion still stood, waiting. The curse evolves. From bloodline to blood debt. By the time the Caldwell family tree had been reduced to broken branches and burial plots, the curse had shifted into something far more dangerous, a living legacy. It was no longer confined to the descendants of Ezekiel. It had become attached to those who knew, those who benefited, those who dared to investigate. It started small. A librarian in Boston who catalogued Margaret's journal was found dead at his desk, his face frozen in a scream, his index finger broken and pointing toward the words, "The debt must be paid." A journalist who published a piece on the Caldwell hauntings began sleepwalking into graveyards, eventually found impaled on an iron fence outside Trinity Cemetery. Then came the researchers. Academics, historians, folklore scholars, anyone who tried to publish or profit from the story, found themselves haunted. At first it was the same old signs, whispers, freezing temperatures, misplaced objects. But then came the visions, bones crawling up through floorboards, old drums pounding behind bookshelves, nightmares so vivid that sleep became a form of suicide. Even tourists were affected. In 1846, a group of curiosity seekers broke into the ruins of the Caldwell mansion and attempted a séance. 3 of them were found hours later, stripped naked and kneeling in the basement, having carved symbols into their own chests. They remembered nothing. The curse had become self-aware, not just a haunting, not just vengeance, but a spiritual organism growing stronger with each retelling. Dr. Cornelius Whitman, the academic who spoke too loud. In 1847, Harvard anthropologist Dr. Cornelius Whitman decided to investigate the Caldwell legend. He was a rationalist, a man who believed all folklore could be traced to natural phenomena and cultural hysteria. He had debunked dozens of regional ghost stories. He expected Millbrook to be no different. He was wrong. Whitman arrived with a team of students and spiritual observers prepared to document the site of the Caldwell mansion with instruments, journals, and photography. The team entered the house for 3 nights. Only Whitman returned. The others weren't killed. They simply disappeared. Whitman's personal journal, later smuggled out of Harvard by a student, contained horrifying entries. The house is a vessel. The bones are circuits. This is not just a haunting. It's a machine of memory and wrath. He described symbols that shifted when unobserved, blood patterns that evaporated under sunlight but reappeared in moonlight. He claimed the walls whispered Ezekiel's name. And most disturbingly, he described visions witnessing the desecration of burial grounds from within the eyes of the dead. Whitman concluded that the Caldwell estate sat atop what he called a spiritual vortex, a collapsed boundary between worlds created by ritualized desecration on an unprecedented scale. His final recommendation: evacuate the region permanently. Salt the land. Seal the memory. No one listened. The dead demand silence. The hauntings of those who speak. By the late 1840s, the Caldwell story had entered public folklore, but those who tried to tell it rarely lived long enough to finish. Authors, preachers, and orators who invoked the story found themselves the subjects of terrifying encounters. The spirits no longer waited for blood, they came for awareness. A preacher in Pittsburgh who used the Caldwell tale as a parable against greed died screaming mid-sermon. Witnesses reported the church walls bleeding, the crucifix above the altar cracking in half. A writer who attempted to publish a serialized novel inspired by the family was institutionalized before the final chapter, muttering about a door in the ground that breathed. A genealogist in Ohio, tracing Caldwell descendants for a government census, vanished. His last entry read, "The blood has been diluted, but the memory is not. They know who we are, even if we don't." Even the land itself seemed to rebel. Attempts to develop the area around Prospect Hill failed. Crops died. Roads cracked. A construction crew sent to late telegraph poles reported hearing chanting from beneath the ground. They fled the site after one worker collapsed, his body covered in ancient bruising patterns shaped like hands. The curse had found its voice, and it wanted silence. Beyond Millbrook, the curse infects the national mind. By 1849, the Caldwell curse had taken root in American consciousness. It had spread beyond the town, beyond the family, beyond the academics. It became a parasitic idea, a haunted meme passed down in whispers and footnotes. Schools in Pennsylvania quietly removed references to Caldwell history. State records were redacted. The name Prospect Hill was removed from maps. But like all attempts at suppression, this only fed the mystery. Travelers reported seeing ghost towns where no towns had ever stood. Lodges of ghostly figures deep in the Allegheny woods. Villagers in distant counties began finding Lapi symbols etched into their barns, their children's toys, even their skin. And then the letters began. Hundreds of people across the U.S. wrote to Pennsylvania authorities claiming to have seen the Caldwell mansion in dreams. Some described walking through it, even interacting with the spirits. Others spoke of being shown something visions of the desecration of bones being used as construction material of fire that couldn't burn, and spirits that couldn't rest. A linguist in Baltimore, upon reading one such letter, noted that many dreamers, separated by state lines, were using identical phrases in native Lapi dialects. Something was happening. The curse was no longer geographical. It was cultural. It had become a contagion of memory. And memory, unlike the dead, never dies. The final sealing, when the government chose fear over truth. In 1850, following mounting reports, psychic incidents, and the unexplained deaths of government agents, a high-level decision was made behind closed doors in Washington, D.C. The Caldwell case was no longer considered folklore or localized haunting. It was categorized as a Category Delta containment anomaly. The government had no vocabulary for what the mansion had become. The last report filed by the U.S. Marshals Service described the Caldwell property as a cognitive infection zone, a place where the rules of memory, identity, and even time began to warp. People who stepped too close didn't just see ghosts. They saw their ancestors commit atrocities. They heard voices in their own DNA. A military cordon was established under the guise of a public safety quarantine for plague exposure. Bulldozers were brought in to demolish the mansion, but the machines failed. Metal corroded overnight. Drivers vomited blood and lost control of their limbs, so they sealed it instead. 4 feet of poured concrete was laid over the foundation. An iron perimeter was erected. Soil from an Apache holy site was scattered over the hilltop, and prayers translated from Lapi and spoken by surviving tribal elders were performed under a blood moon. And then they left it. No plaque, no record. Just a blank spot on the map labeled Federal Reserve Parcel 49A. It was not justice, it was fear. What remains beneath? The mansion still breathes. Even today, the land beneath the concrete pulses. Locals whisper that the earth hums on the anniversary of Ezekiel's first ritual. Trees near the hill bend away from the foundation. No snow ever sticks to it in winter. No flowers bloom within 50 yards. Wildlife dies within minutes if it crosses the barrier. And sometimes, if you stand quietly at dusk, you can hear drumming, not from above, but from below. Hikers who wander too close speak of dizziness, lost time, and the sensation of being watched from inside their own thoughts. Cell phones freeze, compasses spin, cameras won't focus. One paranormal investigator claimed his voice recorder picked up a phrase whispered in 6 voices at once. You tried to forget us. We will be remembered. There is a growing belief among modern occultists and psychic researchers that the Caldwell mansion wasn't buried. It was planted. And now it is growing. The spiral returns. A new generation begins to dream. Beginnings in 2003, reports began to surface online, anonymous forum posts, blog entries, and emails to local historical societies about a recurring dream, a staircase that leads downward forever. A girl with white hair and no eyes. A house that bleeds when touched. The dreamers came from all over Canada, South Africa, Hungary. None knew of the Caldwell family. None had visited Pennsylvania, but each drew the same symbol, a spiral with wings. The spiral, long associated with the Lapi mourning rites, had become a universal glyph for ancestral rage. Scholars were baffled. Neurologists dismissed it, but folklorists knew. This wasn't mythology anymore. It was prophecy. In 2012, a girl in Oregon was found sleepwalking on her roof, whispering the names of every Caldwell who had died. She had no known connection to the family. When asked how she knew the names, she replied, "They told me. They need new doors." The curse had transcended blood. Now it was inside language, inside culture, inside us. Epilogue. You're part of the story. Now you've read their names. You've seen their history. You've heard their pain. And now you've invited them in. Because this isn't just a tale. It's a memory engine. Every time the story is told, the spiral turns. Every time you speak their name, the house rebuilds. Every time you remember, they grow stronger. Ezekiel thought he could steal power from the bones of the innocent. He was wrong. It is they who stole him, his family, his future, and maybe now you. So if tonight you dream of a child with pale eyes, a house that leans left, or a voice calling your name from beneath the floor, do not answer, do not speak, do not remember, because the Caldwell family may be gone, but the spiral never ends.